Perfect. So thank you everyone for joining, and welcome to today's session where we are going to discuss about how the energy web stack is evolving, and how the experiences of these last 3 years have informed our updated technical roadmap and also our commercial strategy. Special thanks to our speakers today. We have Sam, who is our Director of Product Marketing, and Jesse, who is our CEO. And yeah, as always, please send us your questions through either the Q&A box or the chat window, or just by raising your hand and we can unmute you. And we'll be happy to answer all your questions. And yeah, I think that we can kick off. So handing over to you, Sam.
Great. Thanks, Arola, for organizing and hosting as well. Hopefully, is the audio coming through? I seem to be, okay, all good.
Yeah, it's all good.
Wonderful. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Sam here, and wanted to organize this session for a couple of reasons. One is for those of you that are paying close attention to your calendars, you may have thought to yourself over the last few days that this date sounded familiar right around the summer solstice. And it's actually just past the 3rd anniversary of the launch of the Energy Web chain, and our last big get together with a lot of our members in 2019 in Berlin for Event Horizon. So this time of year, for me at least, always kind of brings back some of the memories of different events and things that we've worked with you all as our member community over the years. And so it's a good time to reflect a little bit on kind of where we've been and where we're going. But the timing is also really relevant because our team as Energy Web just actually got together in person for the first time last month. And that was really energizing and refreshing, and to connect with old colleagues and meet some of the newer people who have joined, but also really get deeper alignment on what it is that we're going to be doing going forward, and taking all of those lessons that we've learned over the last several years and applying them to really start to drive impact in the months and years to come. So today, Jesse's going to be joining me to walk through a little bit of a history lesson, but really focusing on some of the key activities and lessons learned over the last now just over 5 years, actually, since we first started Energy Web. And then we want to spend the bulk of the time, at least in the presentation, on where are we going now? And in particular, how are we moving away from offering what we've been describing as just this open source stack or the decentralized operating system? How are we actually going to start packaging those technologies into more usable solutions that make it simple for you all as members to create value from this technology? And we'll close with a little bit of a couple case studies on how companies are using this today, and some calls to action for you all in terms of how you can get involved going forward. So with that, Jesse, over to you for a little trip down memory lane.
Excellent. Thanks, Sam, and thanks everybody for joining. So as Sam's mentioned, shown on this slide, and I remember the day that I presented this slide back in Berlin in 2018, we really have gone through a pretty significant evolution in terms of how we are helping our customers and our members to actually embrace this technology and create business value. And it's worth looking back for a moment just to kind of see where we've came from, especially because I'm looking at the attendee list. We've got a mix of folks that have been with us for a while and folks that are recent newcomers. So back in 2018, we really were focused on this hypothesis that we thought blockchain technology in particular could unlock a lot of different value for the energy sector. And so this was our initial roadmap, very much focused on, blockchain with a capital B, trying to make it easier for different organizations in our community to experiment with this new technology and figure out where the value was. We launched a number of initial working groups that were focused on applying the technology to certificates of origin markets, thinking about how you could use blockchains to enhance specifically demand response programs, and also thinking about could companies use blockchains for billing. So we had these initial working groups, and then we also had a small number of projects that we called lighthouse projects, which were very early stage POCs that were put on by a number of the different members in the ecosystem. You can go to the next slide, Sam.
I will, but before I did want to just point out, for those that are looking closely at that roadmap, yeah, definitely blockchain with a capital B. Pretty much every line item on there is something that's been implemented in the energy web chain. But up in the top right there, you actually see as early back as 2018, there were some folks on the technical side that were already starting to think about the, what is going to become this relay chain architecture. So I found that to be, I hadn't remembered that myself when I was pulling this together.
Nice, indeed. So if we fast forward a year from that that work, and we're back in, I believe this was also in Berlin when we gave this first presentation, we started moving away from really just focusing on the blockchain and said, well, wait a minute, blockchains can be useful for some of these use cases, but there's a lot of other tech that needs to be put together. And we also need to start thinking about how do we make blockchains usable for energy companies in our ecosystem. So we started talking about these energy web software development toolkits. We had one called Origin. We actually had one called Link, that very initially focused on making it easy for devices to connect to different blockchains. We had one called Flex, and then we did some work with our partners at Grid Singularity on this thing called the D3A, which is a transactive energy modeling tool. And really at this time, what we were trying to do is create these software development toolkits so that internal IT teams within our corporate members could take our hypothesis was, which we'll speak more about that in a minute, but our hypothesis was that if we created these toolkits, IT teams within our corporate customers would be able to take them and deploy solutions that would be valuable for the companies. And we really focused those toolkits into two areas. So one was on traceability, and the second was on distributed energy resource integration. And the whole aim here was to try and make it easy for companies to spin up POCs in order to start moving to the minimum viable products. You're good, Sam, you can go on. So if we move forward one more year, everybody here probably remembers how we actually announced a very significant update to how we're describing the energy web stack in general. And in fact, this still lives on the website, although it's going to be changing pretty significantly shortly. And the emerging hypothesis last year was that that toolkit-based approach makes sense, but we've really zeroed in on a couple of technologies that seem to actually be most valuable compared to everything else in this space of decentralized open source technology. And so that's why we released this thing called the Energy Web Decentralized Operating System. And we describe it as an open source stack of standards. We've identified that there's very clear business value for this thing, decentralized identifiers. That's a self-sovereign standard for identity management. If those are new words to folks on the line, we have a lot of documentation and explainers on what that means and why it's valuable that we can provide after the call. But clearly that technology became very interesting for us, and we developed an entire technology stack around it. But what happened is we really started to notice that we have a growing need, at least from the energy web side, to make some of these components and the delivery of those components as repeatable and scalable for enterprises as possible, because same hypothesis here as with the previous slide. Our assumption was that if we brought these different components as shown on this slide to life, companies like yourselves would be able to use either partners or internal software development teams to take those components, stitch them together, and run enterprise applications. Which brings us to today. And you can go to the next one, Sam. We really had a lot of learning through that process. As you just saw from what I showed with the previous slides, we had a big emphasis in the past on how does all of this stuff work? How does blockchain work? How does self-sovereign identities work? How does governance on a blockchain work? Things like that. But what we've learned, and it should be obvious for anybody that's worked at a startup before, we really need to just focus on talking about what does it do? What do all these fancy technologies do? What do they enable? We also really had a big emphasis initially over the past several years on, hey, members, you can build by using these different components. But in our work with a number of the folks even on this line, what we've learned is customers, so energy market participants that we work with, are much more interested in learning about, actually, you can buy this and it can perform these functions and solve these business problems. And finally, the last thing is we've had in our community, and I had actually lumped this into the Web3 and blockchain space in particular, has had a very big project-based focus if we're talking about enterprise application of open source decentralized technologies. but projects are not scalable. Building a single repository for one deployment with one customer in one geography, that is not scalable. So we've moved much more towards positioning all of the software and everything that Sam and I just showed as products or solutions. And so everything on the purple is really what we're moving towards now. And before I hand it over to Sam to talk about some of these new products that we're moving towards, I'd just like to spend one more slide, and you can go to the next one, Sam, really zeroing in on the what. So forget about technology for a second, right? And forget about anything having to do with the energy web stack. What we're really focused in terms of our marketing and bringing new members into the energy web ecosystem and helping existing members understand how value can be unlocked with our solutions. We've gotten quite specific about challenges that we are capable of solving. And so really over the past 5 years, we've identified, tested, and validated 3 very specific business challenges where we believe Web3 tech in particular offers very superior benefits to anything that's existed before. So the first challenge is this: distributed energy resources. And just to be clear, when we talk about DERs, we're not just talking about rooftop solar. We're talking about smart inverters, solar systems, batteries, distributed heating loads, heat pumps, electric vehicles, charging stations. All of those assets are proliferating at different paces in different markets around the world. But generally speaking, grid operators, so distribution utilities and/or transmission system operators or independent system operators, lack tools to really, in a dynamic way, register, monitor, and interact with those assets at scale. So that's one of the challenges we solve. And in that space, we figured out that we can also prevent some outcomes. We can prevent DERs from being underutilized. And at worst, we can actually help grid operators prevent operational issues arising from distributed energy resources. We'll speak about that in a moment about our work in Australia. The second challenge we've really zeroed in on solving here is that energy market participants, specifically grid operators and aggregators and OEMs of these different DERs, need to exchange a lot of data to manage dynamic grids, but doing so can be very expensive, insecure, and challenging to verify. So that has emerged as a challenge that we are more than capable of solving with our technology. And on the other side of that, with a Web3 based technology approach, we can enable energy market participants to exchange data without increasing cybersecurity risk and without incurring very high operating expenses. So that's the second challenge we've really figured out over the past 5 years. The third one, a little bit different than the top two, is a challenge we figured out how to solve, is that buyers and regulators of renewables are demanding more transparency to support different sustainability goals. But the attributes of many of these different green energy supply chains are actually very opaque, and they're also not granular. And when we talk about these supply chains, we're talking about anything from energy attribute certificates for renewables coming from facilities. We're talking about things like sustainable aviation fuel, which we'll talk about in a moment, green hydrogen, even green Bitcoin mining or green cryptocurrency. Most of those supply chains really are not very transparent in terms of tracing them and making ESG claims. So these are 3 of the kind of biggest challenges that we've figured out we can actually create some value around with our members. So Sam, let me stop there and I'll turn it over to you. And I think you're going to talk about how we're actually bringing to life some solutions to hit these challenges head on.
Yeah, and maybe just before skipping ahead, I think it's maybe worth just kind of reemphasizing one overarching theme, right? So these are 3 specific challenges, and one of the things we've been really intentional about is trying to articulate, for whom are these issues most relevant? Like who's going to, where are these barriers inhibiting innovation or inhibiting business models from really thriving around the energy transition? And when you look at all 3 of these, the overarching theme is really about coordination between a lot of different stakeholders who either previously didn't exist, in the case of a lot of these new DER companies and market participants in electricity markets, new products that didn't exist. Let's say with sustainable aviation fuel as an emerging category, we're seeing a lot of interest in that's very new. You have all these different companies and actors with different IT systems, different incentives, different business models, and they need a way to coordinate around specific business processes. And so that's really the crux of where this Web3 technology can make a material impact on improving that coordination function across those different companies. And when you reach under the hood, going back to what you were saying earlier around the how it works, I think what we've realized is it's a lot of the same fundamental technologies, right? It's the same libraries, maybe some of the same components, but it's about packaging them in different ways to really suit these use cases so that you don't have to go and assemble those box of Legos on your own. So with that as a preface, some of you have maybe seen versions of this, but this is our latest bundling, so to speak, of how we're going to be positioning our solutions going forward. So to really touch on each one of those challenges, we have a dedicated solution set for each one of them. The first we're calling Energy Web Asset Management, and it's really targeted at grid operators and other large enterprises, but electric grid operators in particular, mitigate some of the risks associated with managing an increasing number of distributed endpoints. Some of them might be devices that the grid operator owns and operates themselves. Many may be these externally owned endpoints in the form of DERs, but the use case there is really how do you have secure identity and authorization and authentication for all of these different assets and endpoints to interact with different systems throughout their life cycle. The second is Energy Web Data Exchange. And there again, it's about bringing a number of different companies within any given energy market together who have different IT systems, different permissions, different needs in terms of what data inputs they need and outputs they need to present to others. How do you align them around a common digital architecture to enable them to mutually authenticate each other, pass messages back and forth, structure data, and perform different business processes around it? And also, how can we have a more secure and robust way of executing sensitive business logic between those participants? If there's, let's say, a particular algorithm that needs to run to determine a certain kind of outcome in an electricity market, for example, how can you make sure that that's going to be done correctly and not favoring one participant or another across many different stakeholders? The third then is green proofs, and we've already done one separate deep dive session on this, and so I'd encourage anybody who hasn't to watch that recording. But this one is really an extension of a lot of the work we've done with traceability and origin, but with just kind of a new and improved backend behind it to enable a wider range of use cases around that tracing, tracking, and issuing of different types of certificates or programs for green energy supply chains. And so how are we going to actually drive adoption of this and make it easier for people to use? We've talked a bit about how we've in the past just said, if we build it, other companies will be able to go to GitHub, clone a repository, stand something up in their own environment. And there is probably a small segment, as evidenced by some of our members who have actually done just that over the years, who's really willing and able to do that. But it takes a certain skill set, it takes a certain number of resources in order to really make that viable. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about this over the last several months. And I think that WordPress is the best analogy to describe what is it we're trying to achieve here. For those that aren't familiar, WordPress is a content management system that makes it easy to spin up websites. And depending on the metrics, it has somewhere around half of all websites on the internet are running on WordPress. So it's incredibly dominant in terms of market share. It's a completely open source code base, and you can do a complete do-it-yourself option if you want. You can go to wordpress.org, you can download the software, you can run it on your own servers, completely configure it and customize it and run it on your own, just like any open source project out there. But what's more popular and much easier from a user experience perspective is actually buying it as a service. And this is where this role of a managed service provider or a hosting company is really relevant. And that's an area where we as EnergyWeb and many of our members, we see an opportunity to play this role of simplifying the user experience for companies who want to use it. But we want to have the option for anybody to really choose what suits their capabilities, their needs the best. Ultimately, where we want to go with this is to just make it incredibly easy for any one of our member companies to be able to customize and launch one of these solutions in a white labeled way, basically from whatever environment or hosting provider that they're most comfortable with. So specifically, what does that look like? One is, what this visual is illustrating here is having our solutions natively integrated within the app marketplaces of major cloud providers. So in this example, it's Azure, but many companies are using AWS or Google Cloud. We want to be able to enable, for those of you that have gone through this, making it as easy as deploying a new virtual machine with a number of clicks for anybody in your IT system to be able to spin up one of these solutions and host it within your own tenancy. The other one that's not shown here, but for anybody on the line who's familiar with running a validator node on the EnergyWeb chain, will probably empathize with is today using the solutions requires pretty significant proficiency with the command line and being able to download and run a bunch of different scripts and really kind of building from scratch. We want to replace that with the user experience that probably anybody who's used a computer is familiar with. You can, with a number of clicks, run an installer package that'll actually configure the software on your local machine or in a cloud environment with just a few simple interactions with the user interface. So those are significant departures from us in terms of the technology roadmap and strategy, because it's no longer simply about, all right, let's build those fundamental components that do the functional requirements of any type of solution we want to build. What are some of these user experience tooling and features that we need to develop to really make this scale?
And so if we bring some of that together, this is a slide shown from one of the previous sessions we ran on the EnergyWeb Consortia Relay Chain, which is this new piece of technology that we're bringing into the EnergyWeb technology stack. And it's the reason we bring this up here is that this is really our attempt to productize as many of these solutions as possible and make it easy for the companies on this call to deploy them. So we'll be speaking more about the Consortia Relay Chain in the coming weeks and months about how to get involved and how to become a part of it. But the reason we're injecting it here into this presentation is that we really are trying to help the member community understand that every single one of these vertical bars that's shown underneath that Consortia Relay Chain, those are meant to be self-contained instances of our solutions that can be accessed and used by you all in a variety of different ways. And so that's what we're going to talk through next is, connecting this whole concept of productizing EnergyWeb solutions and making them more usable for you all.
Yeah, and I think it's just helping re-emphasize the why are we even talking about this Consortia Relay Chain and substrate and this whole different architecture. Everything that we're talking about with making it easy to spin up these localized instances or have self-contained one-click, it maybe is kind of sort of possible with the existing EnergyWeb chain and tech stack we have, but this technology stack with substrate, it's really purpose built for enabling this exact type of use case. And so I want to walk through what is the vision here and what are we working towards in over the next several quarters to make this possible. So as Jesse mentioned, the vision is that every solution can be locally owned and operated effectively in any type of environment that you want. And what does it look like, or what does it mean to have a kind of productized version of an EnergyWeb solution? It's about really packaging a lot of those components that you may be familiar with if you look at the tech stack today or are familiar with the decentralized operating system into 3 or 4 basic components that you can download and install with a matter of clicks. So the first is this solution client, and may need a better name than that, but effectively packaging multiple components that perform backend functions for any one of these solutions into a downloadable client. So it may have features that perform messaging or data storage or key management or even logic execution, or having almost a distributed consensus protocol for not just the state of the solution, but about the state of some business process that needs to be executed. But in effect, it is something that really provides the back end of a solution, and it would be up to any one of the customers or local markets to decide who are the entities that are going to actually run these nodes, right? You can almost think of them as analogous to a validator node on the energy web chain today, but it's really a backend node performing functional work for this particular solution. Then within any solution, the first thing that would get deployed is a DID-based application that enables administrators within that solution to define and assign different roles to all the different users, whether they're humans or other machines that need to interact with the solution, basically mirroring the experience of a conventional identity and access management platform, but through a DID-based architecture. And then the 2 parts that are really kind of at the forefront of what we're working on actively now are these concepts of client gateways. So I think one of the things that's still confusing to a lot of people who haven't maybe used or interacted with a Web3 application or even anything on the energy web chain is, well, if I'm not a company who's running one of these backend nodes, if let's use an example of we're deploying a data exchange solution within an energy market, and maybe the grid operator is the one running this backend. Well, for all the different companies who need to connect and perform different functions or transactions within this solution, how do they actually use it? We're developing both user interfaces for desktop and eventually mobile that would make it very easy for any human user to be able to set up their identity and then perform different functions within a platform, just like you would in any conventional piece of software, but also a richer suite of both APIs and server-side apps that allow other non-human users to be able to interact and programmatically perform different functions within that platform. For those that maybe are more familiar with kind of existing frameworks for interacting with the energy web chain, you can almost think of this as just a much more feature-rich and robust wallet, or something like MetaMask that would allow you to perform transactions or different functions, establish your identity. But of course, these are much more tailored to a specific use case and suitable for running in an enterprise environment. And so this is really the core focus of the roadmap over the next several quarters. It's, yes, continuing to build out the backend libraries and actual core components, but frankly, through all of the projects we've been doing, those are increasingly mature, and it's now really about packaging them in such a way that makes it easier to deploy this kind of user experience, which, if you just talk about a backend, an identity and access management solution, and a front end, that sounds a lot just like regular software. So this was a slide that maybe some of you have seen before, but wanted to just provide a quick update on it, right? So we're now coming towards the end of Q2 here. And so, as I mentioned, the solutions now are increasingly well-defined, and knowing exactly which of the backend components need to be compiled into these different components to create this comprehensive solution is well underway. The big emphasis over the next quarter is really on the design and defining the user experience and the tooling required to enable this, and getting very specific about which different cloud marketplaces are we going to target first? How is it going to work? For other companies that might want to be a hosting provider, how can we make it easy for them to set up their own instances of this type of energy web solution as a service? So I'll have a little more information in a few slides, but want to emphasize that that's really the focus for the next quarter. And the objective is that we will have tooling available to actually launch these solutions on this consortia relay chain architecture by the first quarter of next year. So to close out, I want to just walk through a little bit more of the framing on, okay, we've talked about the solutions, but how is it actually being used today, and what can we expect going forward? So Jesse, if you want to take this one. You are,
Yep, I'll start with this one, and just the kind of for what we were thinking for the group here before we open it up to questions. Again, this whole webinar is a little bit more about how. So how are we going to make it easy for all of you to deploy these solutions? But just because we do have some new folks on the line, we want to make sure we spend a minute on the what. So what are these solutions, and why are they interesting for these different companies? So here's an example of this enterprise asset management solution. And I don't see anyone from Stedin on the line, or else I'd put them on the spot to actually explain it themselves. But basically, if you are a distribution system operator, or you're a vertically integrated utility, or you are just a grid operator with a lot of assets out there, whether you own them or your customers own them, this solution should be interesting for you. So basically what Stedin has done here, they had effectively no existing system to create a digital tool to register, track, and control not just DERs, but also, in this case, utility-owned assets, specifically some industrial routers that are being used to collect information about basically from a number of different sensors that have been deployed on the network. So they didn't really have a digitized system for tracking those utility-owned assets, and also no digitized system for tracking customer-owned assets in a secure way. And when I say assets here, we're referencing both smart meters and distributed energy resources. So what we've been working with Stedin on is this application that is using an energy web asset management solution to register and manage both of those kinds of assets. So basically something to create a digital identity for tracking throughout its life cycle, both utility-owned assets and then eventually customer-owned assets. And what Stedin has done that's super interesting is that trust in this application doesn't come just from software. This is where a lot of work has been done with a couple of companies, Core and Keegan, to actually put that identity on a SIM card that sits in these, in this case, these industrial routers. So really interesting application. We've got some other documentation for this available on the Energy Web website. But again, the primary pain point being here is that there wasn't a enterprise grade digital system for tracking these different kinds of assets that are on the distribution utilities network. And this solves that problem. So this basically gives them the tool to be able to do that. And right now there's a second MVP currently being built to really push that device level trust component. What does it look like at scale to be using SIM cards to make it so that you can establish a incredibly cyber secure connection with these different devices on their network? So that's the current status of the project.
Great. So then the leading example of the implementation of the data exchange solution is in support of more dynamic DER markets in Australia. So here the primary customer is the Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO. They play the role of the TSO or the ISO, depending on your familiarity and framework. But they're the entity responsible for running the wholesale markets in Australia. And for anybody who follows, the Australian energy transition is really at the leading edge of anywhere in the world, with roughly half of the homes and businesses in the country having solar and or battery storage. So the adoption of DERs is quite significant, and it's still early stages for electric vehicles. And when you look at some of the trend lines for forecasting that in the future, there are, in the not too distant future, forecasts where there will be many hours throughout the course of the year where different states and regions can be running 100% on DER resources to supply all demand. So that presents just a really fundamentally different operating paradigm and set of requirements for not just AMO as the wholesale market and transmission operator, but increasingly also for the distribution network companies who need to start to perform more of a role as a DSO or distribution system operator as well. And so the use case here is about how can DERs be increasingly utilized to provide not only services in the wholesale market, but also concurrently local services for the distribution system operators. Today, those two worlds between AMO and the DSOs are really quite segmented, and there's not a lot of direct feedback between them. And so there are a number of different functions that need to happen, from not only the DER registration and coordination of which DERs belong in which aggregator portfolios and at which time are they allocated to different markets, but also more operational data from the distribution level that might inform different constraints into what is allowed or what's not going to harm the distribution grid if it's dispatched from the transmission level. So it really about a many-to-many data exchange and coordination use case there. And there's actually two separate off-market trials. One is in the East, and that's called Project Edge. One is in the West, called Project Symphony. We're in the stages of actually rolling out the MVP solutions, and within a matter of months, we'll be moving into the actual off-market trial where there will be on the order, I believe it's several hundreds of customers and devices on the order of 10, I think, ish megawatts of capacity, actually using the system to demonstrate the viability of how you can increasingly utilize these assets for both local and wholesale services at once.
And the last example we wanted to talk through is on the third solution that we're focused on, is this concept of green proofs, is what we call it, which again is about registering, tracking, and trading low carbon products in a scalable, transparent way. There's a couple of different examples of green proofs out there. Folks have probably seen our announcements on different 24/7 solutions. So we're actually using this green proof solution to enable different market participants to launch and deploy 24/7 tracking solutions for electricity. We also are using green proofs to help cryptocurrency miners, in particular Bitcoin miners, actually prove how much electricity they're using and have they or have they not purchased renewables to make that electricity effectively green. What was announced just 2 days ago was a really interesting project brought to market by Shell, Accenture, and with support from American Express, focused on a very different supply chain, but using a similar technology approach, sustainable aviation fuel. So the challenge in this space, right, one of the only ways we're going to decarbonize air travel is by using different feedstocks for aviation fuel. And those feedstocks are very small. The market for sustainable aviation fuel right now is incredibly small. I recently saw a statistic. It was something like less than 0.5% of the global supply of aviation fuel is bio-based, right? It's a very small market, but there's a number of different market participants who, as shown on this slide, they want transparency and the ability end-to-end to show that they're actually contributing to purchasing more sustainable aviation fuel to help that industry grow. So that's the challenge. There is no kind of framework or digital tool for actually tracking a company purchasing units of sustainable aviation fuel and those units of aviation fuel contributing to the decarbonization of the global aviation fuel fleet. So what they've done here is built a solution that makes it really easy for airlines and travelers to actually trace sustainable aviation fuel through every step of that supply chain. And then with that tool in hand, they can also calculate the emissions benefit of using sustainable aviation fuel instead of using normal kerosene. So this is really interesting to see this solution come to market. It's now been deployed on the mainnet energy web chain. And we're also doing some additional work in this space with some other market participants on aviation fuel. So we're very excited about this. And it's a great example of just how this greenproof solution is enabling a number of different market participants to create value in this space.
Right, and that's maybe a good place to end on is really want to emphasize the point that the combination of this new architecture and commercial model is really designed to make it clear and obvious what are the business opportunities for every single one of our member organizations. If you are an energy market participant, whether in the electricity sector or fuels or anyone who's really focused on energy markets as their core business, one or more of these solutions should be hopefully inspiring a light bulb moment of saying, okay, I see where my company fits and where we can use that solution to create business value today. We're going to be starting to curate more content and demonstrations and tutorials specific to these solutions. And so I've listed some of the different Slack channels that I've just set up, and coming out of the webinar, we can send this around as well. But really want to emphasize that there should be an opportunity for you really immediately to not have to go back to the drawing board. When I thought about the number of projects we've done and workshops, I calculated, right, it's many thousands of hours and certainly millions of dollars collectively invested by our community over the last 5 years to really hone in on these solutions. So we're confident that there will be ways that you can start to use it and drive innovation within your organization in a much lower friction way than it has been in the past. And then for the companies in the ecosystem that are more focused on the technology side, there is a huge opportunity here for more companies to build businesses as managed service providers for energy web solutions. So the example I was giving about WordPress earlier, if you look, there's WordPress.com, which is the commercial arm of the open source foundation. There are literally dozens of other companies that have built up profitable businesses as WordPress hosting providers. That's the exact type of model that we want to aim for, where we as Energy Web do not have to be the only companies who are actually helping configure and host these solutions. And actually that last example Jesse just talked about, where Shell and Accenture were really the ones driving it, that's a perfect example where the more that we can make it easy for technology providers to actually host these solutions, just the more impact we're going to have as a community. The two calls to action that I'll leave us with is that even though we're starting to really refine our thinking here and focus both our technology strategy and our commercial strategy in this way, there's still some fine details that we want to stress test with you all as members in the coming months. So in particular around the pricing and packaging, we're going to have some design workshops internally in the coming weeks. We recently were participating in a public tender and got some pretty interesting feedback on how these types of solutions can be structured in such a way just to make them, let's say, feel more traditional in terms of IT procurement. What does the upfront cost look like? What does it look like buying it as a service? And so that's really informing a lot of our thinking there. And on the technology provider side, we're actually going to be having a multi-day working session with our technology and delivery teams, really focused on that user experience of each step of what does it mean to be able to deploy these solutions within a cloud marketplace, within kind of more traditional installer package type of experience. And so again, we have a lot of ideas there, but want to bounce them off anybody who's interested, and also find ways to bring on more companies so that they can be off and running as soon as the technology is available. I'll also offer anybody can get in touch with me if you're interested in any of this. For those that have been around longer, I've historically been focused a lot more on the operational side of things, but my whole world now is really focused on how can we scale all of this and really drive impact and bring these solutions to market over the next 12 to 18 months. And so would love to hear from you and hopefully have some more discussions. But with that, I know we've got a little over 10 minutes before the top of the hour, so would love to open it up for any questions.
And again, folks should feel, we really encourage folks to join the new Slack channels. We're going to be providing quite a bit of content about these different solutions. And we'll have also available a number of different demos in case you want to go deeper on the business case behind any of them or the tech behind the scenes. So please do engage with us on Slack as we bring these new channels live.
All right, well, I will take the silence as hopefully a sign that we've just explained everything completely perfectly and everybody is totally understanding it. But I suspect there'll be maybe more things that come up after the fact. And so again, I'll put the slide back up. These are all public channels in the member Slack. So hopefully you can find them. Otherwise, I'll be posting in the general channel sometime shortly, and you can join there. Also be on the lookout, and Rolla, I don't know if you know off the top of your head, but we'll be scheduling more specific events focused on the asset management and the data exchange solutions in particular, and then some more sessions focused more on the commercial piece, especially around the pricing and packaging and how it looks deploying these with the new architecture. So exciting times ahead, and thanks everybody for your time today, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.